Okay, so this presentation is diving into grief and just understanding grief in general. This presentation will cover identifying various symptoms of grief, understanding different factors that might affect the process of what grief looks like and how it's experienced by somebody who is experiencing grief, um, differentiating between grief and depression, and then also identifying resources to support yourself or somebody that you know who might be experiencing grief. So we hear about grief frequently. It's a natural part of our lives to include loss, but it's a topic that we often resist diving into too much. On the right side is a list of some forms of loss over which we might experience grief. And as you can see, it's not all about loss of life, although loss of life is certainly on there in various forms as well. We can experience feelings of loss around moving, leaving a job, graduating from school, or loss of independence in one way or another. But before we get into specific symptoms of grief, it's important to differentiate between different words and different language that come up around grief, those being grief, mourning, and bereavement. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they actually refer to very different processes within the same sort of experience. So grief is considered the normal process of reacting to a loss. So as I mentioned, losses can include the loss of a close friend, death of a loved one, or just even of somebody that you know, serious illnesses of a loved one, a breakup, leaving home or moving, illnesses or loss of health, changing jobs, graduating from school, loss of physical ability, or even loss of financial security. And by no means is this list exhaustive either. But mourning, on the other hand, refers to the process by which people adapt to the loss that they've experienced and are grieving. And finally, bereavement. This is talking about the period after a loss during which grief and mourning occur. So they're somewhat similar, but also referring to the distinct processes. So grief can look a little bit different for different people, and especially within different contexts or kinds of losses. In general, though, symptoms of grief will diminish for most people in most cases within 6 to 10 weeks. However, they may include one or more of these symptoms to different capacities. So those being numbness, sadness, despair, anger, irritability, whether that's at the somebody who is deceased, at oneself, at others, or at a higher power. Symptoms of anxiety, problems with sleeping, difficulty concentrating, changes in appetite, struggling to gain motivation or energy, losing interest in things that you used to find pleasurable, feeling like you're going crazy in some sense or wanting to escape all of the feelings, feeling guilty or remorse, and even in some cases just feeling ambivalent. So the process of grief affects us significantly and takes a huge emotional toll on us. As we experience these emotional, psychological, and physical symptoms, there's also a deep biological response that's happening in our brains. Hormone and chemical changes in our brains will disrupt brain functions and communications that are normally occurring and actually shift us into an emergency mode. So grief affects us in a couple areas of the brain. First being the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind our forehead and is part of the brain responsible for things like planning, self-control, self-expression, reasoning, and finding meaning in different things. Grief, loss, and trauma all affect this part of our brains, impacting our ability to express emotions or voice our desires. And these tasks actually become exhausting when we're in this type of mode. Differences in prefrontal cortex functioning between those who are grieving and those who are not grieving actually show up on brain scans. So you can see the difference in how this region of the brain is activating when somebody's in grief. And grief also affects the emotion-related area of the brain, being the limbic system. Particularly within this area is the hippocampus, or particularly affected within this area is the hippocampus, which is an area within the limbic system that's responsible for memory-related processes, like our ability to recall information, integrate emotion with memory, attend to various stimuli, things going on around us, and even being able to take interest in others and other people and other things. Grief is perceived by the brain as a threat, and the amygdala, the emotion center of the brain, actually tells your body to resist the grief. As a result, you may experience strong instinctual responses or triggers that actually remind you of your loss. So you might think of this in terms of somebody who's experienced a trauma as a flashback, but in this case, it may look a little bit different. And when we experience stress, which includes loss, grief, and trauma, we alter the normal flow of our nervous system too. So on one hand, within our nervous system is what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which contains processes like fight or flight, which is actually what's going on when our amygdala is activated for threat detection, like I just talked about. When the sympathetic nervous system is engaged, which again occurs during stress and threat response, the other side of our nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, actually slows down. And the parasympathetic nervous system is located in our brainstem in the lower part of our spinal cord for the most part, and handles things like rest, breathing, and digestion. So when you're in grief, you might notice that your breath becomes short or shallow, appetite disappears or increases dramatically, and you might experience problems with sleep, or insomnia might become an issue, or oversleeping, things like that. So when your sympathetic nervous system is engaged because you're experiencing stress, the parasympathetic nervous system is not able to activate in the same way that it is when you are a little bit more at peace. So sometimes so much of this is happening at once and it actually overpowers your brain's resources. As a protective measure, your brain might begin to feel like it's shutting down a little bit, and you might start to draw blanks, daydream, long painfully for a loved one, if that's the grief or loss that's been experienced, and everyday business of housework or paperwork, busy work, it just becomes less important. And grief really becomes front and center of your attention. But your brain is really doing its best to help you adjust. As a stressor, grief being a stressor, a very unique, powerful, and terrible stressor to experience, it's important to build healthy coping mechanisms to be able to manage the stress of grief, while also taking on this unique existential stress that grief can cause. So there are several types of grief, each of which vary in terms of when grief occurs, why it occurs, and the role in one's day-to-day life that it might be affecting. Anticipatory grief is a form of grief that occurs before a loss or a death. This is often experienced in reaction to a terminal diagnosis or a life-threatening illness of a loved one. Acute grief, this is something that occurs in the early period after a loss and often dominates the life of a bereaved person. Somebody experiencing acute grief might have strong feelings of yearning, longing, and sorrow. These are typical as our inconsistent or insistent thoughts and memories of what was or who was lost. There might also be painful emotions like anxiety, anger, remorse, guilt, or even shame. And activities are really focused on doing or not doing things in effort to deal with the loss directly. Disenfranchised grief is experienced by people who experience a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. So for example, Disenfranchised grief might be experienced by somebody who's lost a loved one to AIDS or to suicide, the death of a pet, or psychological losses such as a partner developing Alzheimer's disease. And so due to this type of loss, there might not be a formal mourning practice or recognition by others that would comfort the grieving individual. And consequently, individuals experiencing disenfranchised grief might suffer intensified symptoms due to this lack of social support. Complicated grief is a persistent form of intense grief in which unhelpful thoughts and unhelpful behaviors are present, along with this prolonged, continued yearning, longing, and sadness. This type of grief continues to dominate the life of a bereaved person, leaving them feeling as if the future is bleak and empty. And thoughts of a deceased person might reappear. Thoughts that a deceased person might reappear are actually common among people experiencing complicated grief, and just general feelings of being alone and lost. Lastly, though, is integrated grief. And this is the lasting form of grief in which loss-related thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are integrated into a bereaved person's ongoing functioning. In this case, grief is able to take a place in a person's life without dominating their life completely. And as is illustrated on the right, here's an image that does a good job of illustrating what integrated grief might look like. It's one who has experienced loss. You don't just forget about it after that 6 to 10 week period of time when we expect symptoms to diminish, but instead we learn to lessen the effects of grief and continue on with life. It just becomes a little bit less heavy, but it's still there. Losing a loved one is one of the most distressing and unfortunately common experiences that people face. And for the most part, the experience of grief and bereavement follow a relatively similar trajectory with periods of sorrow, numbness, and even guilt and anger. Gradually, though, these feelings ease and it's possible to accept loss and move forward. However, for some people, feelings of loss are debilitating and they don't improve even after sufficient time has passed, or during that's the amount of time we'd expect those feelings to pass. And this is known as complicated grief. So in complicated grief, sometimes also referred to as complex grief, painful emotions are so long-lasting and so severe that people experiencing it have trouble recovering from a loss and resuming their own lives. Some risk factors for developing this type of grief include experiencing a death or a loss that's traumatic, premature, violent, or just altogether unexpected, sudden. Another risk factor is a death or a loss of somebody that you had a significantly close relationship with. Also things like social isolation, loss of a support system, or having a history of mental health concerns like depression, separation anxiety, or a history of post-traumatic stress disorder. Also things like experiencing major life stressors, or holding a stigmatized view of what grief looks like, such as believing that having a reaction to death is showing a sign of weakness in some way. Also things like fear of losing sanity, or going crazy from thinking too much about the experience of loss. And then lastly is rumination, which is when we think about something over and over again. And so ruminating about how the experienced loss could have been prevented, just reliving that. And so the more of these experiences, the more of these risk factors one has, the more likely they are to develop complex or complicated grief. So another distinction that I want to make is between grief and depression. So grief, especially complicated grief, and depression are frequently mischaracterized as being similar in their symptoms, but there are actually important differences between the two. Complicated grief might present with intense sadness, anger, irritability, while depression might present with feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, irritability or anxiety, sluggishness, and difficulties completing daily tasks. In complicated grief, there might be a difficulty to accept a loss or focusing excessively on it, while in depression, there might be feelings of guilt that are entirely unrelated to a loss. And further, some people experiencing complicated grief may have thoughts about wanting to join a lost loved one, which is very distinct from thoughts of suicide that may be experienced by somebody with depression. And so these can be experienced simultaneously, but they are different experiences. And so, to put it simply, grief often rides like a wave. So a grieving person can typically find ways to find moments of happiness inside the dark experience that grief is. So something might make them smile or offer a moment of joy throughout their day. But with depression, for those experiencing depression, it often just feels like being buried in a dark hole with no light and no happiness for a really, really long time. So it's a lot harder to make somebody smile if they're experiencing depression, but with grief, it's a little bit different. So how do you support yourself or support somebody else who is experiencing grief? So some recommendations include engaging in social support, engaging in self-care activities, and taking care of your emotional wellness. So engaging in social support by talking to a loved one about a loss that's been experienced, by seeking counseling, by engaging in socially driven activities, or by joining support groups are all really, really great ways to lessen the effects of grief and take care of yourself in that period of time. And if you're looking to support somebody else, just being a non-judgmental listener is a really great way to support somebody who's experiencing a loss. People tend to open up when they feel like they've been heard and they're being validated. And it can be tempting to try to solve the problem, try to solve the pain. But in this case, like in many cases, simply listening and offering empathy can be healing enough. And some activities to promote self-care might include things like reading poetry or reading books, whether that's to distract yourself or find a voice with a shared experience of pain, of grief. Also things like regularly exercising and continuing to eat well and nourish your body are really important and often forgotten about during periods of pain. Also considering things like listening to music or journaling, again, just because of the effects of emotional wellness that these can have on us. And so if you're thinking about how to support a friend or a loved one who's experienced a loss and is experiencing grief, in this area, you might consider making dinner for them, since they might not have that motivation or energy to cook a nourishing meal, or offer them a journal or letters to encourage them to engage in emotional processing. And then another area to focus on is emotional self-care, which you can foster through seeking spiritual support in whatever form that might look like for you. And I also want to note that that might not be a helpful option for everybody, but that is a possibility. And you can also try to set aside time to just relax and be with yourself. And then 2 important ways to be supportive of yourself are to, 1, be patient with yourself, knowing that it's not a forever feeling of pain, and 2, allow yourself to feel those feelings. Avoiding our feelings only makes them more distracting and more hurtful. Just let yourself grieve and let yourself experience those feelings. Again, being patient with yourself through that time. And if you're looking to support somebody else experiencing these things, Also encouraging them to take time for themselves and reminding them to be patient and gentle with themselves through this process. So these are some common barriers to healing from a loss, put together by Shear 2020. Sources will be at the very end of this presentation, but this one is certainly worth looking into. So some of these barriers that Shear has identified, or that they're calling derailers, include things like doubting that you did enough for a person who has died, or experiencing caregiver self-blame. Again, this is many of these resources and sources are referring to death as a form of grief, but keeping in mind that this can look different and grief can be experienced by other forms of loss. So also embracing the idea that intense grief is the only way to honor a person who has died. Again, these being derailers, so things getting in the way of us being able to move towards healing. Repeatedly imagining scenarios where a death didn't happen or happened differently, kind of that if only thinking. Feelings of anger and bitterness that you can't resolve or let go of. Insistent belief that this death was unfair, was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. Not having faith in the possibility of adapting to a loss or having a promising future. Excessively avoiding reminders of the loss, going out of your way not to think of it. Projecting support from others, not letting other people help you, feeling hurt and alone. And survivor guilt that is stopping you from experiencing joy and satisfaction. So be on the lookout for these barriers within yourself or within others, so that you can get support as is necessary so that you can move toward these milestones that are listed here, which indicate one who is grieving is actually in the process of healing and moving toward an acceptance of the reality of the loss that has been experienced. So this path of healing is indicative of restoring purpose and meaning, restoring feelings of competence and of mattering and belonging. And so these healing milestones include things like honoring your loved one and yourself, reconnecting with your own interests and values, easing emotional pain, getting to know your emotions, both painful and pleasant ones. This one's really allowing yourself to feel emotions, accepting grief and letting it find a place in your life, learning to live with reminders of your loss, integrating memories in meaningful ways that can help you learn and grow, narrating stories of the death to understand and accept its reality, gathering friends and loved ones to let them into your life, let them support you. So these are all indicative of healing, and the ideal way to go about the process of grief, to avoid prolonged and intensified symptoms. So if you're supporting somebody who has experienced a loss, it's also incredibly important to consider how they might be experiencing or perceiving that loss to be. So I wanted to talk about a couple cultural considerations that might come up when you're supporting somebody. So on one hand, there are beliefs about the loss that need to be considered. So if this person has experienced a loss of life, so they're grieving a death of a loved one, consider how they understand death and dying, and what that might look like for them. If they've lost a social role, how do they understand their current role and their current agency, their current independence and ability to make changes in their lives? And then especially when it comes to death, spirituality can play a huge role in how loss is processed for some, but not all. So considering things like how they understand what happens after death, making sure that you're not assuming anything. And whatever perceptions they hold, it might make it more difficult or easier in some cases as well to adjust depending on the context of the loss, but keeping it in mind. And then taking into account how certain traditions or rituals might impact the process of grieving too. So funeral rituals, in one sense or another, are important across multiple cultures, but the inability to hold traditional funeral services at this point in time due to the current health crisis, this being put together and recorded during the era of COVID-19 and social distancing orders, this may impact the process of grieving for somebody who's lost somebody during this time. And then again, I wanted to highlight that ideally, we're not assuming that this is going to be the same for everybody, and we're not projecting our values and beliefs about this process onto a person who's grieving, because that won't be helpful. It'll actually be more harmful. So some resources. If you're interested in any of these, just go ahead and pause the lecture, and feel free to visit any of these. The National Helpline is confidential, free, 24-hour a day, 365-day a year information service. They have services in English as well as Spanish for anybody who is experiencing or has a family member experiencing a mental or substance use disorder. And even within grief, although it might not be a mental health disorder, it certainly warrants a call to help find more services. And then I've also included some websites here: Open to Hope, Resources for Survivors of Suicide, National Widowers Organization. There's also many more out there to help support you in whatever loss you've experienced. And then also consider reaching out to local in your community to local hospice centers, hospitals, or places of worship for local support groups within grief. It's one thing to have social support. It's another to have social support from somebody who's experienced the same pain that you've experienced. So that was our presentation on understanding grief from the Pacific University MEMRI Clinic's Healthy Aging webinar mini-series. Our contact information is here if you want to reach out to us or follow up for any questions or slides. And here are some great resources that we use to put together this presentation. Thank you.